Okay, people, so it's been a long time since I've shot a video on a book, reviewed a book, and I'm going to do a review here. This is of Iain McGilchrist's book called The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. I don't know how long it's going to take me to shoot this video. This video may be a very long video. I'm going to see how long I can go. It may even go into a couple of videos here, depending on, I guess, when I get exhausted talking about this. I think it's really an excellent book. It's really I should say that To Be Serious had mentioned it to me a couple of times in response to some of the videos that I have posted, and now looking at the book, I have had a chance to read it. And I'm reading it, I guess, in the context of a whole bunch of other things. I can't recommend the book enough. And I think to anyone who has read it, or if you go get a copy and want to read it, get involved. Let's get a reading group going around this book. I'm going to see if I can't initiate some of that. I think, although I don't do anything in neurophysiology, and I've shot no videos really on neurophysiological work. The rough argument that he's making throughout the book can be found in countless videos of mine. That is, so many of my videos are addressing, I think, the concerns that he has. Well, it's partly because he's very multidisciplinary. He's concerned with taking contemporary neurophysiology and brain research, but bringing it to the history of Western thought, the shaping of Western consciousness, Western experience, but also he's very familiar with philosophy, with schools of music and literature, and he's trying to give this again an overarching view, but I don't think he's trying to be dogmatic. Like, I don't think he's given this comprehensive view of everything. I think there are some concerns about it. He's very good at telling a story, and I'll see if I can't get to some of the criticisms. But I have some various criticisms of the book. I think that the first thing that I would say about it is, for somebody who wants to understand the book, if you really want to have your mind blown by the book, here's my recommendation. The first thing you need to do is to read Martin Buber's book, I and Thou. Now, he doesn't reference the book I and Thou. There's no reference to Buber made in the book, but by the time you get to the very end, this last chapter, he has a line here on page 445. He says, "We are at the risk of becoming trapped in the I-it world with all that exists, through which we might discover the I-thou world being progressively blocked off." And this distinction between the I-thou and the I-it is so crucial. It kind of undergirds his entire book, although he doesn't make any reference to it. If anyone would go read, and I do have a video on Buber's book, I and Thou. If you read Buber's I and Thou, his discussion of the I-thou attitude and the I-it attitude, which are both the twofold attitude of the human, the I-thou is the right hemisphere, and the I-it is the left hemisphere. So first you have to read Buber's I-thou. Then you need to read Anthony Wilden's book, System and Structure. Read that, which has the essay Analog and Digital Communication, or read his book, The Rules Are No Game, which has probably a direct parallel to McGilchrist's arguments here. If you want to get into Heidegger and understand Heidegger's contribution, you could try to do Being and Time. I would recommend The History of the Concept of Time or The Basic Problems of Phenomenology. Both of those are wonderful texts. In particular, it's the way that Heidegger is addressing the difference between pre-reflective consciousness, the sort of whole immersiveness by which one opens to the larger world in its existential particularity, the kind of living eventfulness of the world, as opposed to the reflective, analytic, abstract thought about it, which it sort of puts things in a relief and in a detached way sort of gazes upon things. So those three sources, I think, would really be very helpful background reading for someone who wants to then jump into the book. Okay, so the book itself is divided into two main parts. One is a very, very impressive, I'll just say that, very impressive review of contemporary neurophysiology in terms of the two hemispheres. And in some ways, I think one way to say it is he's doing the inverse or the opposite of Julian Jaynes. If people are familiar with Julian Jaynes, he has a somewhat well-known book called The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And Jaynes argues that people had experienced, I guess, something like a divine commands that were felt to be wholly other, and then there was a breakdown in that, and that was the origin of consciousness. Whereas McGilchrist is kind of arguing the opposite. It has to do with the way that the division between the hemispheres became more and more possible. And okay, see, some of this gets really complicated. Okay, first off, I want to say that he does at times, I think, seem to be, for purposes of the narrative, for purposes of the left hemisphere, and for purposes of a story and a model, he kind of oversimplifies it as if the left hemisphere does this and the right hemisphere does that. He qualifies to death all the way through, but I think it does come across a little bit that way. But I think the real point is that both hemispheres normally are in play. The corpus callosum is a connector between them and does do the main, I guess, bulk of interhemispheric communication, but it's also largely an inhibitory function. And the role of negation and of inhibition is probably one of the key concepts throughout McGilchrist's work. That is, not only is the corpus callosum largely responsible for interhemispheric communication, but much of it is inhibitory. That is, it tells one hemisphere not to take care of it because this one's got it. It's sort of like this, like one tells one to stop activating. Especially, that's also the case with the frontal cortex, the most late developed part of the human brain, where so the frontal part, it has a largely negative or inhibiting function whereby it tells you not to do something or not to do it, and for brain activities to become activated or not. And again, so much Hegel throughout the book. A lot of the book is about, for him, again, the way that the hemispheres became separated off. And so the first half of the book is about the neurophysiology, and then the second half is a kind of history of the way those hemispheric developments have played out. So let me first talk a little bit about the neurophysiology. And again, I would really love it. People, go get this book. Let's start having a book club on this right now. This is a book that everyone should be reading. To me, this is a really, really important book. Okay, so first I'm going to try to see if I can't talk about the two hemispheres and their relationship, sort of this Hegelian notion. Okay, so Hegel, as I think people know, has a notion of there is a thesis, an antithesis, and then a synthesis, right? The sort of classic move. Not that he's directly taking that, but he is sort of seeing the proper function, you could say, of the hemispheres is a kind of pendulum swing back and forth, first with the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is the real brain. It's the dominant hemisphere. Unlike I guess, a lot of neurophysiological literature, which ends up calling the left hemisphere the dominant hemisphere because it's the hemisphere that deals largely with the analytical rationality part of language and of conscious, explicit willed thought. But his argument is that no, the real master is the right hemisphere, and the left hemisphere is the emissary. It's radically dependent upon the right hemisphere. Now, the right hemisphere needs the left hemisphere, but the right hemisphere really is dominant. And so what happens is the openness to the newness, to what he's going to call the in-betweenness, the ultimate relatedness of all to all, and the living once occurrent presentation. Now, not the representation, the actual presentation, the way that space and time make room for themselves cosmically. I mean, the actual, I mean, your right hemisphere is a register of the living, real relationships as they are in a once occurrent way. Those then they're open to the change, the flux, the ever once occurrent, but it gets shunted over into the left hemisphere. Now, the left hemisphere is like the master model maker. It it's superlative at constructing abstract representations. It makes again images and models, and it's very good at being detached and representing, but it likes clarity and distinctness, and it can't tolerate ambiguity. It doesn't accept ambiguity. Whereas the right hemisphere not only, I guess, tolerates ambiguity, recognizes ambiguity, the left hemisphere not only denies ambiguity, but sees ambiguity as a problem. Similarly with metaphor, it's like the right hemisphere is more comfortable with metaphor, recognizes that metaphor offers a certain kind of truth, that metaphor is the only way that some things can present themselves, whereas to the left hemisphere, that, because metaphor is imprecise or metaphor uses vague language, it's somehow false, it's not true, it's a lie, it's a distortion. And so the left hemisphere is really very dogmatic, but it's really good at details. Okay, so let's talk about this. I mean, the importance of the right hemisphere is that the right hemisphere is really good at larger wholes, with putting things into context, with understanding the importance of context, the value of larger context. The left hemisphere, in being analytical, is really an expert at parts, at utilization. See, to the world that's made in the left hemisphere, and the world really is made in the left hemisphere, whereas in the right hemisphere, it's the world to which we open, which is more than us, which is other than us. The left hemisphere, it's a world that's made and constructed in terms of how things could be used and how they appear given the use value that they have. And the whole world seems to be instrumentalized by the left hemisphere. And that's very important, right? Again, Buber's work on I, thou, and I, it is so crucial here. You can't live in the world of I, thou. You need the I, it. But if you live only in I, it, you've dehumanized yourself. You've almost left yourself to be a kind of machine, and you're living by a machine metaphor, not realizing it. Because the left hemisphere is very good at constructing models, it also is very good at denying its own denial of ambiguity. It pretends that the world that it has is sufficient. And I want to stress that when I'm giving some of these arguments, and I'm trying to repeat a lot of what I think McGilchrist is making, the claims that he's making in the argument. So if you disagree with what I'm claiming, please read the book before you want to haggle. And then if you want to say that I'm not representing his view correctly, I'm happy to have people correct that. But please, let's turn to the text and let's hear what people are going to say. Okay, where was I? I think the point, though, is that ideally, the right hemisphere and left hemisphere, not only do they work conjointly and in some degree of unison, but as the corpus callosum became stronger in its inhibitory function, there was more of a pendulum kind of swing, so that the right hemisphere opens to the ever-changing actual reality in its once occurrence, its particularity, its context boundness, its openness to wholes, and then the left hemisphere it constructs models that allow for focused in and detailed representation, that allow for a usefulness of the world, and then ideally it gets shunted back over to the right, and there's kind of growth and development between the hemispheres, and so that the hemispheres themselves seem to be characterized by a kind of asymmetry, and that asymmetry, I guess, represents for him this lateralness of swinging back and forth, in that's a proper function of the whole brain, I guess, to go from reason, which is for him on the right side, and it's also empathy, that the right hemisphere is the empathic hemisphere. It's the hemisphere that opens to the other. It's the one that's most resonant with music, with love, with art. Whereas the left hemisphere is mechanical. It's really coded for the non-living, the inanimate. It deals with that part of language which is non-metaphorical and which is analytic. So the linguistic parts of my speech right now, that's largely being coded by the left hemisphere, whereas the right hemisphere is picking up the tone, the pitch, the relationship values, those concrete, ways that you can feel the relationship being accomplished through the sounds as once occurrent particular context dependent. Those are the right hemisphere. The decontextualizable analytic semantic values, those are the left hemisphere. Time itself is mechanistically represented as measurable standardized units. I mean, even people some can seem to be substitutable, interchangeable, mechanized units within the left hemisphere's model of the world, whereas the right hemisphere, it recognizes the context dependency, the particularity, the ways in which people are not substitutable, interchangeable. The right hemisphere is the expert in recognizing faces. And okay, I think what I was going to say before is that so much of the work that McGilchrist is doing here is not only analyzing which parts of the brain are being activated during different kinds of activities, but it's coming from research in brain lesions and in different forms of brain dysfunction where when there's a deficit in one hemisphere, the other hemisphere sometimes gets called in. And so, just as an example, people who have right hemisphere deficits, or maybe there's brain lesions in the right occipital lobe here, or something like this, they have certain a brain condition where they're unable to recognize faces. And it was funny, I just happened to see a television show on, it was like 60 Minutes had done a special on, I can't remember the name of it, I'm not even going to say it. It's an agnosia of some sort where people are unable to recognize faces. And they can see the elements clear enough, but the faces themselves, they can't see out of the whole. And so I guess the point here would be that the brain is really complicated. One of the things that he doesn't talk about at all in the book, which I would maybe want to follow up on, and this would be, again, it would take us way far away. His focus is upon schizophrenia, and he really wants to say that schizophrenia has a lot of the characteristics of left hemisphere dominance, of basically deficits in the right hemisphere. But I was thinking about, there's so many different kinds of epilepsy. It would be really interesting to look at the different forms of epilepsy and the different kinds of experiences that go with it. Just for example, if a person happens to have left temporal lobe epilepsy, so take that one, left temporal lobe, so sort of left hemispheric lesions, they may have profound religious experiences, profound, I guess, connections to the larger world. They could feel strange senses of deja vu, or as if all people, other creatures seem to be relatives. And what's interesting in a case like that is it's not necessarily, now again, it would depend, you'd have to look at the brain activity, the EEGs, you'd have to see other things, but it's not necessarily that the part of the brain that's damaged is causing the experience. No, it could be that the damaged part is rendered inactive, and then the right hemisphere is coming in and opening onto that. So again, a person who is flooded with a sudden sense of religious awe through a left temporal lobe, a kind of a deja vu or a kind of seizure, it's not necessarily that the brain damaged left hemisphere is giving a hallucination of religious awe. No, it's that the right hemisphere, which is the hemisphere of religious awe, of otherness, of in-betweenness, of love, suddenly gets overly stimulated and overly activated. It's sort of like the matrix, which is the left hemisphere, suddenly gets broken down, and there's like breaks through the cracks, a sudden appearance of the originalness of the world. See, I think there's a lot about time. I was saying before that, and again, his work is so much more on schizophrenia, right? That it's about the overly analytic loss of context that's part of the real concern. But I think this notion of time is really interesting. He wants to suggest that the right hemisphere is largely the most activated and the dominant during the first years of our lives, say the first 5 years or so. And then slowly we become increasingly left here, a hemisphere dominated as language becomes more prominent and as people I guess, rely upon a rationality of thinking about things, and they start to, I don't know, I guess, ridicule maybe the intuitive sense, the felt sense of things. And so you can see in McGilchrist's work, right, what he's really, I guess, trying to get at here is that there's an ongoing tension in our conscious lives between, on one sense, our right hemisphere, which is, again, a sort of openness to the ever changing, to the once occurrent, to the in betweenness, to the otherness, to that sort of opens with a sense of love and a sense of longing. See, longing is the notion that he would use for the right hemisphere, whereas desire is the notion for the left hemisphere. Desire is more, I guess, attuned to an object consciously sought after in terms of potential use it has to me. It's already been idified, to use Buber's terms a little bit, and it's already been represented. Whereas longing is a presentation, it's an openness to what is potentially unknown and yet other and yet felt in an intuitive sense to be right. Now, in left hemisphere dominance, the intuitive senses of empathy, senses of tolerance for ambiguity, they'll be ridiculed and scorned, they'll be marked with suspicion. And the person who's left hemisphere dominant will be very dogmatic about the fact that ambiguity is a problem. Whereas the right hemisphere, I guess, not only understands the degree to which the world is ambiguous, but it sees ambiguity as part of the world itself. That the left hemisphere, it's almost like it can't recognize the degree to which it's trapped within a hall of mirrors, where the right hemisphere recognizes that and yet is tolerant of it. It's almost like it's a tolerant master who is allowing the specialization and the focused attention that the left hemisphere is able to do. But the left hemisphere, in its special focused attention, it's sort of unaware that it depends upon this master and tries to seek a dominance that it would never be able to achieve, but it needs to block from itself that fact. And so it has a tendency to be overly dogmatic. And again, there's good reason for that to be very useful. Okay, that's a lot of the neurophysiology. And I want people to please shoot video responses, go get this book. Let me see if I can't do maybe a real brief history of his discussion of the history as this plays out. And I probably want to shoot some maybe further videos on some of the finer detailed arguments here. But he's kind of suggesting, if you go back to the ancient world, the Hellenistic period wasn't, as many people suggest, this coming to dominance of the left hemisphere. No, for him, instead, the early Hellenistic period, where you're talking about Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the birth of it really was full optimization of both hemispheres. Full optimization of both hemispheres in full connectivity of being able to use both to their maximal potential and keep each other in check in a kind of balanced harmony. But with Roman imperialism, Roman expansion, the concretization of culture through Roman conquest, and the making over of culture, I guess, through dogma and through expanded reliance upon rationality rather than metaphorical reasoning, and the detached syllogistic reasoning, the way that gaze became increasingly detached and reflective. And then by the time you get 313, Edict of Milan, it's ossification, I guess, of the Roman period. It's increasingly left hemisphere dominated, and it turns into, for him, 900 year some period or so of the eclipse of novelty, of insight, of things of change. And then slowly, though, it creeps back in, and boom, we have the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is the great awakening of the right hemisphere again, with the Renaissance being the empathic age, the age of other and of feeling and of music, of rediscovery of music. And then that an awakening of kind of, I guess, religious forms of sediment that are removed from theology. See, religious awe is the right hemisphere. Theology, religions, organized religion, that's the left hemisphere. But so then the Protestant Reformation, the Reformation represents the swing back right away toward the left hemisphere dominance, where theology and the spelling out of religious doctrine becomes secularized and starts to, I guess, really change people's orientation toward how they're supposed to think about religiosity and spirituality. Then that, I guess, continues out and makes way for the Enlightenment, right? Where the Enlightenment for him is, it's a wonderful, I guess, celebration of the right of the left hemisphere, where a new kind of analysis comes to bear and people become, I guess, it's very difficult. The Enlightenment today, we see with such celebration, and I think it should be seen that. I think he does see it a little bit to be, somewhat similar to a recovery of ancient Greece, and it's like both hemispheres working in unison, but it too quickly becomes over dogmatized right away, that it becomes potently, with Descartes representing this sort of hyper-rationalist mechanistic model, that mechanistic models start to dominate and to rule, and mechanistic lifelessness and detached, just detached spectatorship of life starts to dominate in that period, and he sees that as an unfortunate underbelly, to which the Romantic period then you see as a recovery of a reawakening of remembrance of Shakespeare, of musicality again, of once occurrence, of uniqueness, of what can't be captured by any model, of the non-repeatable, of, I guess, of essences which aren't Platonic forms, but are essences which are once occurrent essences that register the utter uniqueness of something rather than its the way that it's typified by being part of a group or a category. And then he says, the most fearful event for him, the sort of proverbial coffin nails, where potentially the left hemisphere has now been increasingly sealed off in a fate where it's unable to reach back and to gain the insights of the inpouring openness of the right hemisphere, is the Industrial Revolution. That the Industrial Revolution increasingly created a world in which everything that people encounter is not simply an openness or something that's new, but it's something that's already been represented because it's been created by hands. And the world that we live in is a manufactured world. It's a world of substitutable objects. When I have a pen, the pen is, it is a mechanical object, and we're increasingly surrounded by lifeless things, so much so that we've come to take ourselves to be machines, and people have come to see themselves as very substitutable. And he does offer some hope toward the end, and I'll see if I can't talk more about the book. I think I'm running out of gas here. First off, please check out the book. I think it's awesome. I'll put a link down to it. If you found any of those ideas interesting, I have countless videos addressing so much of this. Check out some of my other books. I mean, so many of the books, my first book and my book, it was Selfhood and Authenticity, and my book Sources of Significance, I mean, they were largely trying to trace out some of these tensions in, I guess, what it means to be a person, as well as how is a meaningful life to be made in work environments and in interpersonal relationships. It's a book really worth checking out. Please, I would love for people to get the book, and let's talk more about it. Okay, thanks.